If you are listening to this right now on your commute, I want you to just look out the window for a second.
Yeah, literally just take a look around.
Right, look at the paved roads, the traffic lights, the power lines, the sheer density of the infrastructure that's just everywhere around you.
It's easy to take it all for granted, honestly.
It really is. And look at the people in the cars next to you. People who, statistically speaking, have access to antibiotics, to a stabilized electrical grid, and, well, to at least a basic secondary education.
Which is huge.
Yeah. What you were looking at is human development happening in real time. But here is the thing about development. We tend to view it like a medical diagnosis, right?
Right, we expect precision.
Yeah.
Like totally binary.
Exactly. You break your arm, the x-ray shows a jagged white line, and the doctor just points to it and says, there's the problem, and here's the solution.
It's a very comforting way to view the world, because it allows us to categorize our progress so neatly, broken or not broken, developing or developed.
Right, but when you step into the world of global macroeconomic data, when you try to actually measure the progress of 8 billion human lives, that x-ray machine fundamentally breaks down.
Oh, totally. You just get this incredibly murky diagnostic landscape.
And that brings us to the core of what we are unpacking today. I want you, the listener, to hold this massive counterintuitive paradox in your head.
It's a big one.
It is.
Yeah.
So we finally have the complete global data set for the year 2023. And in 2023, the Global Human Development Index, the HDI, which is basically the gold standard for measuring our progress, hit an all-time historical peak.
It's a literal summit.
Right. The number is 0.756. So by every traditional metric, humanity has never been more developed. We are standing at the absolute peak of the mountain.
Which, if you just read the headline, sounds like an unmitigated triumph.
Yeah.
A peak is a peak, right?
But here is where we introduce the twist. Here is this concept of false prosperity.
This is where the data gets wild.
Yeah. What if this peak, this 0.756, is actually an illusion? Because when you take this exact same brilliant data and you adjust it, when you send humanity the invoice for the environmental costs we are extracting from the Earth to build those roads and hospitals.
But when you deduct the structural friction of how unevenly this progress is actually shared.
Exactly. When you do that, the global progress doesn't just dip a little bit. It gets rolled back by an entire decade.
10 whole years of progress just erased. It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
It really is.
But what's so fascinating here is that the nominal numbers, they aren't lying to us. We have just been asking them the wrong questions this whole time.
Yeah, we've been looking at the volume of growth without interrogating the actual architecture of that growth.
Right, the structure underneath it all.
And that is exactly what we are doing today. Welcome to this deep dive. We have our hands on a massive, really comprehensive data set covering global human development from the year 1990 all the way up to 2023.
It's a goldmine of information.
It is. And our mission today is to figure out if the traditional logic of growth at all costs is, well, officially broken. We are going to unpack the hidden traps, the shadows, and those invisible anchors behind the world's climbing HDI curve.
It is such a necessary journey because the data we are looking at tracks literally everything from human life expectancy to the actual tonnage of materials we pull out of the Earth's crust.
It reveals some profound systemic realities, so we're going to slice right through those shiny top-line numbers to show you the structural truth underneath.
Sounds good. Let's get into it.
Let's start at the beginning of the curve. Let's look at the baseline. If we rewind to the year 1990, the Global Human Development Index was sitting at 0.608.
Okay.
Now, before we just throw decimals around, what does a 0.608 actually look like compared to where we are now?
It is a vastly different world. A global average of 0.608 means you are looking at a planet where a massive portion of the population completely lacks access to basic sanitation.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a world where dial-up internet is barely a concept in the wealthiest nations, where childhood mortality from preventable diseases is heartbreakingly common.
Right.
And we're dropping out of school before the 6th grade is just the norm for millions of people.
That's a stark picture. And from that 0.608 in 1990, we see this beautiful, steady, almost relentless climb up, 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 all the way to 0.745 by the year 2019.
A nearly 30-year bull run of human progress.
Yeah. Now, to put a 0.14 jump in perspective for the listener, that is not just a statistical rounding error. That is the difference between a country where rolling blackouts are a daily reality and a country with a stabilized grid where graduating high school is a baseline expectation.
Exactly. It looks like a 30-year staircase of just pure human triumph.
But then the data shows a massive stumble.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
The great slide of 2020 and 2021.
Yeah, for the first time in 30 years, we see a major global regression. The HDI drops consecutively down to 0.742.
And the data set attributes this to global systemic shocks.
Mm.
Obviously, the pandemic is the big one.
Right, COVID changed everything.
COVID, supply chain collapses, global conflicts. It was a moment where the world essentially held its breath and lost its footing.
But humanity is incredibly resilient, right? The data shows a sharp recovery, and by 2023, we bounced back and hit that historical high of 0.756.
We did. But if we want to understand what that 0.756 actually means, we have to pull it apart.
Let's do it.
Because the Human Development Index is not a magic number pulled from thin air. It rests on three foundational pillars: health, education, and income.
Okay, health, education, income.
Right. To truly appreciate the 30-year ascent you just described, we need to look at the mechanics, like the literal nuts and bolts of those three pillars.
Okay, let's look at the engine of this growth. First pillar, health. The data here is genuinely staggering. Global life expectancy jumped from 65.1 years in 1990 to 73.4 years in 2023.
We really need to pause and think about the physical infrastructure required to add over 8 years to the average human lifespan globally.
It's mind-blowing when you frame it like that. 8 extra years for the average human.
It does not happen by accident. It requires the systematic eradication of endemic diseases. It requires the vast expansion of municipal water treatment facilities so people aren't, drinking contaminated water.
Right.
It requires the mass deployment of antibiotics and, crucially, a global cold chain logistics network.
Okay, actually explain the cold chain, because I think people take that for granted. I know I do.
Sure. So to get a vaccine from a laboratory in Switzerland to a rural village in sub-Saharan Africa back in the 1990s, you needed a continuous chain of refrigeration.
Oh, because the vaccine goes bad if it gets warm.
Exactly. You needed kerosene-powered refrigerators in off-grid clinics. You needed motorcycles outfitted with insulated coolers. And you needed local healthcare workers trained to administer them.
That's a massive logistical undertaking.
It's an invisible infrastructure.
Yeah.
And that is how we added those 8 years. Health is the absolute bedrock of a society.
Because you can't really do anything else if you're sick?
Precisely. You cannot build a complex, functioning economy if your workforce is constantly decimated by preventable illnesses.
And it fundamentally changes the timeline and the sociology of a human life. Think about what those extra 8 years mean on a human level.
It's generational.
Yeah, it means grandparents are living long enough to actively participate in the raising of the next generation.
Yeah.
It means institutional knowledge stays in the workforce and in the community longer. It is a profound shift.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's health. The second pillar is education. The data shows mean years of schooling rose from 5.85 years in 1990 to 8.77 years in 2023.
That is almost a full 3 additional years of formal knowledge acquisition for the average person on Earth.
Right, so we go from an average person leaving school before they even finish elementary school to an average person completing middle school and heading toward high school.
Which is a massive cognitive upgrade for the planet.
It is, but how does that actually translate to development? Like, what does 3 years of school physically change on a macro level?
Well, it changes the structural capacity of a society. If health ensures the human machine can physically run, education determines the complexity of the tasks that machine can actually perform.
Oh, I like that distinction.
Yeah. When a brain gets 3 more years of schooling, you are forging synaptic connections focused on abstract reasoning, literacy, and basic mathematics.
Things that let you participate in a modern economy.
Exactly. An extra 3 years means billions of people moving from a baseline of basic agricultural or manual labor into the capacity for literacy-driven work.
Wow.
It means a farmer can actually read the chemical safety manual on a new fertilizer. It means a worker can operate a computerized loom. It allows an entire society to adapt to new technologies.
Okay, so we have the human machine running longer and running smarter. That brings us to the third pillar, income.
The fuel.
The fuel is a good way to put it.
Gross national income, or GNI per capita, nearly doubled over this 30-year period. It went from $11,274 in 1990 to $20,327 in 2023, and that is adjusted for purchasing power. And this is the expansionary force. Income is what allows a family to upgrade from a thatched roof that lets in disease-carrying mosquitoes to a sealed metal roof, which secures the health pillar.
I see how they connect now.
Right. It allows a family to buy a bicycle so their child can travel to a secondary school in the next town over, securing the education pillar.
So the three pillars are deeply symbiotic. They feed into one another in this continuous upward spiral.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have the engine roaring, the baseline is up. It's like a high-speed cross-country road trip where the engine is humming, the chassis is strong, and the speedometer says we're going faster than ever.
Right.
But we started this deep dive talking about a paradox. If I'm looking at this 0.756 and life expectancy is up, education is up, and income has doubled, why does it feel like there is so much friction in the world right now?
That's the billion-dollar question.
Why are the dashboard warning lights flashing red if the car is running perfectly?
To understand that, I want to use an analogy. Imagine a massive hospital ward, and I am the head doctor.
Okay, doctor.
I walk out into the waiting room and tell you, great news. The average temperature of the patients in this ward is a perfectly healthy 98.6 degrees. You might think everything is totally fine, right?
Right, 98.6 is perfect. I'd be relieved.
But what if I didn't tell you that half the patients in the room have severe hypothermia and the other half are burning up with 104-degree fever?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's not fine at all.
The average is mathematically true, but functionally, it is a complete lie. It completely obscures the lived reality of the actual patients.
That's horrifying, but that's exactly what our global HDI is doing, isn't it?
Yes, an average smooths out all the pain. To see the true picture, we have to look at the shadow cast by this very progress. We have to look at inequality.
And this brings us to the first major adjustment in the data set. The researchers introduce a modified metric here called the IHDI, the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index.
This is where things get real.
Yeah, this is where the false prosperity really starts to reveal itself. When you factor in the sheer inequality of how this health, education, and wealth are actually distributed among populations, we suffer what the data calls a systemic loss.
A massive loss.
In 2023, the global human development total loss rate due to inequality was nearly 22%. It's precisely 21.96%.
Almost a quarter of all human progress effectively erased from the lived experience of the average person simply because that progress is aggregated at the top rather than shared.
That is just staggering. Let's ground this in the numbers so the listener can really feel the impact of this.
Good idea.
We had this shiny nominal HDI of 0.756. But when you apply that 22% tax, the real inequality-adjusted lived experience for the average human walking the earth plummets to 0.590.
Back into the zeros.
0.590. We just spent 10 minutes talking about the beautiful 30-year climb, and inequality operates like a time machine, mathematically dragging us backward and completely erasing the last decade of gains.
It's brutal. And what is particularly revealing is how this inequality tax is levied across our three pillars. Because they do not behave the same way at all.
No, they don't.
The data set breaks down the inequality loss into income, education, and health. Let's look at the health pillar first. Surprisingly, it is actually the most equitable pillar we have.
Really?
Yes, the inequality loss for health in 2023 was only 12.9%.
Well, okay, wait. I have to push back on this a little bit.
Sure, go ahead.
Is global health really that equitable? Because I vividly remembered 2021. We just lived through a massive pandemic where wealthy nations hoarded vaccines, they rolled out multiple booster shots, while developing nations waited months just to get a first dose for their frontline workers.
That's very true.
That felt like the absolute definition of inequity. How can the data say health only suffers a 12% inequality loss?
That is a very sharp observation, and it highlights the difference between an acute crisis and a 30-year aggregate trend. You are absolutely right about the vaccine hoarding during the pandemic. That was a glaring failure of equity. But the HDI is measuring long-term structural baselines, primarily life expectancy.
Ah, right. Life expectancy.
And the reason health is mathematically the most equitable pillar comes down to two things: biological limits and the nature of public health infrastructure.
What do you mean by biological limits?
Well, a billionaire can acquire 10,000 times more wealth than a middle-class worker. There is basically no ceiling on income.
Right.
But a billionaire cannot buy 200 years of life expectancy. Biology enforces a strict upper limit. You simply cannot hoard decades of life.
That makes total sense. Even all the money in the world only buys you so many years.
Exactly. Conversely, when a government implements a public health intervention, like a clean municipal water system or a nationwide polio vaccination drive, it benefits the entire population simultaneously.
The pipes go to everyone's house.
Right. Public health interventions scale very equitably. You elevate the bottom of the curve drastically without needing to extend the top.
Ah, I see. A rising tide actually does lift all boats when it comes to clean drinking water. that makes sense.
Exactly.
Okay, so health has a 12.9% loss. Next is education. The data shows this is the fastest improving dimension when it comes to equality.
Which is great news.
It is. The inequality loss in education dropped from 26.2% back in 2010 down to 21.46% in 2023.
Which reflect a massive, highly successful global push over the last decade to get children, especially in developing nations, into primary and secondary schools.
Building a school and enforcing mandatory attendance acts as a great structural equalizer, right?
It really does. The gap between the completely uneducated and the educated is shrinking globally and doing so fairly rapidly.
But then we hit the brick wall, the third dimension, income.
Yeah, this is the tough one.
This is the most stubborn, entrenched, and highest source of inequality in the entire dataset. It consistently suffers a loss coefficient of over 30%. In 2023, it was 30.35%. It just refuses to budge.
It's essentially frozen.
So help me understand this. If education is getting so much easier to distribute fairly and health is relatively equitable, why is the wealth gap remaining completely frozen over 30%?
That is the core friction.
We are creating a world of highly educated, perfectly healthy people. Why can't they access fair economic opportunities?
This points to a profound structural friction in how our global economy functions. And I want to be clear, the data isn't making a moral judgment here. It's showing us a mathematical inefficiency.
Okay, mathematical inefficiency.
You can distribute textbooks, and you can distribute vaccines relatively easily with enough political will and logistics. But distributing economic leverage, distributing ownership, capital, and access to high-paying markets, that disrupts entrenched systems.
Because capital compounds,
Yeah.
right? Wealth generates wealth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The system allows human capital like health and education to be built at the bottom, but it does not equally reward the deployment of that capital.
Wow.
When 30% of human potential is locked behind an income barrier, that is aggregate global growth simply left on the table.
The system allows human capital to be built, but it does not equally reward the deployment of that capital. That is a fascinating way to frame it.
And if we truly want to understand this disconnect, this gaping chasm between gaining knowledge and gaining economic power, we cannot just look at general wealth brackets.
We have to look deeper.
We have to look at the sharpest, most universal divide of all. We have to look at the gender gap.
Which brings us to the Gender Development Index, or the GDI. We are going to look at progress and survival in schooling through the lens of gender.
The data here is really interesting.
First off, the top-line GDI ratio is actually very encouraging. The index moved from 0.908 in 1993 to 0.955 in 2023.
And for the listener, a score of 1.0 would mean perfect parity between men and women, so we're getting much closer.
It is a strong, positive trajectory. If we look at the raw human development numbers for 2023, the female HDI reached 0.737, while the male HDI was 0.772. The gap is still there, but the scissors are closing.
They are, and the victories inside these numbers, especially regarding survival, are phenomenal.
Yeah, let's talk about survival. The maternal mortality ratio, the MMR, plummeted. In 1990, there were 365 maternal deaths per 100,000 live births globally. By 2023, that number was driven down to 216.
We really must pause to acknowledge the magnitude of what that means. That is, thousands upon thousands of women surviving childbirth every single year who would have died 3 decades ago.
It's incredible.
It means families are kept intact, children grow up with their mothers. But again, how do we do it? It wasn't magic.
No, it was targeted interventions, right?
Yes, it was targeted investments in highly specific medical interventions.
Yeah.
It was the training of skilled birth attendants and midwives in rural areas.
Right.
It was the distribution of oxytocin to stop postpartum hemorrhage. It was the building of sterile clinics and establishing emergency transport protocols for obstructed labor.
These are some of the most direct, visible, and unassailable successes in this entire data set.
Absolutely. They represent massive policy wins.
And right alongside that survival rate, we see the adolescent birth rate nearly halved. It went from 74.9 births per 1,000 young women in 1990 all the way down to 39.1 in 2023.
Which ties directly back to our education pillar. When an adolescent girl is not forced into early motherhood, she remains in the education system.
She gains that human capital.
Exactly. She gets those crucial extra years of synaptic development.
And the data shows exactly that. We see a massive influx of knowledge and power for women. Secondary education coverage for women has hit 62% globally, which is closing in fast on the male rate of 70.2%.
That gap is closing rapidly.
Furthermore, if we look at political power, women now hold 26.5% of parliament seats globally. That is up from just 11.5% in 1990.
More than double.
So I'm looking at all this, and I am genuinely thrilled. Women are surviving childbirth at vastly higher rates. They are getting educated almost at parity with men, and they are gaining real legislative power in governments worldwide.
The human capital is being built.
Exactly. The system is working.
Yes. Yes, it is.
Yeah. Uh-oh. I hear the but. What is the catch?
This is where the data reveals a shocking, incredibly counterintuitive structural resistance.
Okay.
We have built the human capital, we have educated women, we have kept them healthy, but we are failing to utilize them in the economy.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have a metric called the Gender Inequality Index, the GII. Overall, the GII has dropped from 0.582 in 1993 to 0.455 in 2023.
So the number is going down.
Right. The number is going down, so inequality is decreasing overall. That is progress.
It is progress, but it is moving significantly slower than the education and health metrics would suggest it should.
Because if education is nearly equal, economic output should be nearly equal.
Exactly. The reason for this drag is found in a very specific, deeply troubling data point. It might be the most counterintuitive finding in our entire analysis.
I remember reading this in the notes, and I literally had to stop and reread it to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding the chart.
It's a tough one to wrap your head around.
We are talking about the labor force participation rate, the LFPR. Listen to this. Despite the massive leaps in female education, despite the incredible gains in female health and survival since 1993, the female labor participation rate actually declined.
It went backward.
It went from 50.7% in 1993 down to 48.47% in 2023.
We really need to let that sink in. We have spent 30 years making women healthier and more educated than at any point in human history, and yet a smaller percentage of them are participating in the formal economic labor force today than they were 30 years ago.
I don't understand. For context, the data set notes that the male participation rate also dropped slightly from 79.4% to 74.1%.
Right, which is largely due to people staying in school longer and aging populations retiring.
Okay, but the gap between men and women remains massive, and the female rate is actually moving backward. How does this make any logical sense?
It defies traditional economic logic.
If women are matching men in education and they are surviving childbirth to actually utilize those degrees, wouldn't we expect them to be flooding the global workforce?
You would absolutely expect that.
Why are the economic numbers not reflecting this educational boom? We are equipping half the population with the tools to succeed, and then what?
It exposes a total disconnect between the acquisition of human capital and the deployment of that capital. And the reason for this requires us to look at profound structural and societal barriers.
Okay, let's talk about the barriers.
First, we have to talk about the unpaid care economy, the invisible labor.
The second shift.
Exactly. As societies develop, and even as women gain advanced degrees, the societal expectation that women must shoulder the vast majority of unpaid domestic labor, childcare, elder care, cooking, household management, that expectation has proven incredibly rigid.
So the degree doesn't erase the laundry?
No, it doesn't. An educated woman still only has 24 hours in a day. If structural support for childcare does not exist, or if it's just prohibitively expensive, she's often forced out of the formal labor market to manage the informal, unpaid market at home.
It's like we built this massive, incredibly expensive pipeline. We spent 30 years constructing this pipeline of education and health, expecting it to pour all this brilliant human potential directly into the economy.
And it does, up to a point.
But there's a giant structural leak right at the factory door. Society is effectively saying, here is your high school diploma, here is your university degree, congratulations on your perfect health, now stay home.
Stay home, or enter a workplace that is openly hostile to your reality. That is the second major barrier.
Hostile now.
The modern corporate workplace in many parts of the world was designed decades ago around a model of a single, usually male, breadwinner who had someone at home managing all of his life's logistics.
Oh, right, the 1950s model.
Exactly. Workplaces have largely failed to adapt to a modernized, dual-income workforce.
What does that failure to adapt actually look like in the data?
It looks like a lack of flexible hours. It looks like punitive policies around maternity and paternity leave. It looks like systemic wage gaps where women are paid less for the exact same work.
Which then makes it a rational economic choice for The woman to be the one who quits her job when childcare becomes too expensive.
Right. Exactly. If she's making less, it's the logical choice for the family budget. All of these factors create a hostile environment for the very human capital we just spent decades and billions of dollars building.
So when we looked earlier at that stubborn 30% income inequality, this gender-labor paradox is a massive driver of that friction.
It's a huge component of it.
We are literally leaving half of our global talent, half of our potential economic growth on the table.
We are. Humanity is failing to fully utilize half of its population in the formal economic sphere. But what is truly alarming is what we are doing simultaneously.
What do you mean?
While we are vastly underutilizing our people, we are drastically overutilizing our planet.
Which brings us to the final and arguably the most terrifying adjustment of the HDI, the Earth's invoice.
This is where the goal comes due.
We have looked at the cost of inequality. Now we look at the cost of extraction. The dataset introduces a metric called the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, the PHDI.
Right, the PHDI.
This metric takes our shiny nominal HDI of 0.756 and it charges us a fee. It forces us to confront the material reality of our development.
It asks a very simple physical question. How much of the Earth did we burn, dig up, and consume to achieve our longer lifespans and our better schools?
Let's read the invoice. First item, carbon emissions. Per capita CO2 emissions rose from 4.18 tons in 1990 to 4.54 tons in 2023.
That's a steady increase.
It is. But the second item, and this one genuinely stopped me in my tracks, the material footprint. This metric measures the average human's consumption of the Earth's natural resources. We're talking biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, and non-metallic minerals like sand and gravel.
The sheer physical weight of our lives.
Yes. In 1990, the average person consumed 8.67 tons of the Earth per year. By 2023, that number has rocketed to 12.71 tons.
That is a nearly 46% increase in the material weight of a human lifestyle in just 30 years.
I want the listener to try and visualize 12.7 tons. We are talking about nearly 13 tons of Earth extracted per person per year.
It's hard to even picture.
That is the weight of 6 or 7 cars dug out of the Earth, processed and consumed for every single man, woman, and child on the planet every single year. How is that physically possible?
Because development, as we currently practice it, is incredibly heavy. When you build a hospital to increase life expectancy, you need concrete.
Right.
Concrete requires mining sand and limestone. When you build a power grid to run the schools, you need copper wiring, you need steel, you need coal or natural gas.
Everything is connected to extraction.
Everything. When you manufacture a smartphone to access the internet, you are mining lithium, cobalt, and rare earth metals. The 13 tons is the physical footprint of the 0.756 HDI.
And what does the invoice say at the bottom? What is the penalty to our development index? In 1990, the planetary pressure loss to our Human Development Index was 7.56%.
Okay.
By 2023, that penalty has expanded to 10.05%.
This is the dangerous divergence. This is the absolute core of the false prosperity we discussed at the very beginning of the deep dive.
Because the cost is rising faster than the benefit.
Exactly. For every single unit of human progress we have achieved in the last 30 years, the relative stress on the planet has compounded. We have completely failed to decouple our well-being from resource extraction.
Let's define decouple for a second, just to be clear for everyone.
Decoupling means finding a way to make the HDI line go up, improving health, education, and income, while making the material footprint line stay flat or go down.
By getting more efficient.
Right. It means growing smart rather than growing heavy. But the data shows we are failing to do this. Our growth is still fundamentally tied to brute force extraction.
It feels like we have been living on a planetary credit card.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
We have been funding our longer lifespans, our incredible hospitals, and our universities with high-interest debt taken out against the Earth itself. And looking at this 10% loss rate, the interest payments on that debt are starting to outpace our actual income. We are maxing out the card.
That is exactly what the PHDI is telling us. It is the bill coming due. Presented purely as an objective ledger of planetary costs against human gains, the math is entirely unsustainable.
It just doesn't add up long term.
A 10% loss rate on our aggregate development means the environmental debt is actively dragging down our net progress. If the material footprint continues to rise by 46% every few decades, the ecological foundation that supports the health and income pillars will inevitably fracture.
Because the environment supports the infrastructure.
Right. You cannot have a high-functioning healthcare system on a planet dealing with catastrophic climate instability. The pillars will eventually collapse under their own weight.
So, what does this all mean? How do we hold all of this in our heads at once? We are healthier and smarter than ever, yet we are deeply unequal. We are structurally blocking half our population from the workforce, and we are burning down the house to pay for it all.
It's a lot to process.
It is. Let's synthesize this. Let's look at the 4 phases of development in 2023.
If we summarize the data set, the 4 phases of our current world state are these. First, the nominal HDI, sitting at 0.756. This is the illusion. It is the face of unblemished, steady progress.
Okay, that's phase 1.
Phase 2 is the IHDI, sitting at 0.590. This is the reality of inequality. It shows us that 22% of our progress is mathematically lost to structural friction and unfair distribution.
The inequality tax.
Right. Phase 3 is the PHDI, sitting at 0.680. This is the ecological reality. It shows us the 10% expanding penalty for our planetary overdraft.
It's a planetary credit card.
Yes. And phase 4 is the GDI, sitting at 0.955. The gender reality, showing brilliant closing gaps in human capital, but hiding the stagnant, leaky pipeline of labor participation beneath it.
When you lay it out like that, the ultimate conclusion of this massive 30-year dataset becomes undeniable. Humanity's greatest enemy remains internal inequality, the structural friction that prevents people from deploying their potential.
And our most existential hidden threat is the overdraft of planetary resources.
It demands a new blueprint, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The data makes it overwhelmingly clear that true future development cannot simply be about driving up the numerical volume of the standard HDI.
Because more of the same just creates more problems.
Exactly. If we just push income higher using the exact same methods we used for the last 30 years, we will just increase that 30% inequality gap and explode the 10% planetary penalty.
So, based purely on what the data demands, what are the policy shifts required? How do we fix the blueprint?
First, on the gender front, the policy goals have to shift. The victory of getting girls in school is largely being won. That was the battle of the last 30 years.
And we should celebrate that.
We should. But the new frontier, the battle for the next 30 years, is structural guarantees in the labor market. Development must mean creating an economy where an educated woman is actively integrated into the workforce through subsidized care economies, flexible workplace structures, and dismantled biases.
The pipeline of education must be permanently connected to the reservoir of the economy. We have to fix the leak at the factory door.
Exactly. Secondly, we must urgently decouple our 12.7-ton material footprint from human happiness. This is the mathematical imperative of the green transition.
So we have to figure out how to generate high life expectancy and high education while extracting maybe 5 tons of earth per person, not 13.
Right. We have to transition from an extractive growth model to a regenerative one.
Health and education are up globally, which is wonderful. We should absolutely celebrate that we have eradicated diseases and put billions of kids in school. But the data shows us that the system is fundamentally inefficient.
Very inefficient.
It is broken if it hoards wealth at the very top, if it strands highly educated women outside the workforce to do unpaid labor, and if it burns through 13 tons of the planet per person to achieve those very gains.
That's the reality of the numbers.
So if you are listening to this on your commute or walking your dog, I want you to reflect on this for a second. When you look at your own country, your own city, your own neighborhood, do you feel the 0.756 prosperity? Or do you feel the 0.590 inequality?
It's a great question to ask yourself.
When you look around, do you feel the friction between these numbers in your daily life? Do you see the planetary credit card being swiped every time a new concrete high-rise goes up? Because these aren't just abstract statistics floating in a spreadsheet. This is the mathematical ledger of our daily existence.
They are the invisible forces shaping the cost of your groceries, the structural constraints on your career choices, and the literal weather patterns outside your window.
Well, this has been an absolutely incredible journey. Thank you for guiding us through this. Unpacking 30 years of global human data is no small feat.
It was my pleasure, truly.
It is truly eye-opening to realize that human progress isn't just a straight line upward on a graph. It's a complex, multidimensional puzzle full of shadows, structural friction, and hidden invoices.
And I want to leave the listener with one final provocative thought to chew on.
Oh, please do.
We have seen the data. We know the costs. So if our current models require burning more of the earth to produce an economy that actively excludes half the population from participating equally, well, maybe we need to completely redefine the word developed.
Oh, I like that. Redefine developed. What does that look like?
What if a truly developed country isn't the one with the highest gross income at all? What if, in the 21st century, the definition of developed is the nation that generates the most human well-being per ton of carbon emitted?
Wow.
What if it is the country with the lowest penalty for simply being born a certain gender or in a certain zip code? What if efficiency of well-being, rather than sheer volume of extraction, becomes our new North Star?
That is a powerful lens to look through, generating the most well-being per ton of carbon. I love that. So to our listener, the next time you read a headline celebrating a surge in economic growth or a new peak in traditional development, I encourage you to look past those top-line numbers.
Keep digging.
Remember the hospital ward with the perfect average temperature? Remember that the picture is murky. Always look for the hidden shadows of the data. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.